History sometimes turns not on vast armies or sweeping declarations, but on a single decision made in a moment of pride.
Finest
A door
silks
closes.
from the east.
A message is mishandled. A leader misjudges the resolve of the man across the table. In the early 13th century, such a decision set in motion one of the most devastating military campaigns the medieval world would ever witness. At the center of it stood Genghis Khan, a ruler who understood that power was not merely about conquest, but about credibility. By 1218, the Mongol Empire was no longer a loose confederation of steppe tribes. It was a disciplined, expanding force stretching across northern China and Central Asia, built on mobility, intelligence networks, and absolute unity of command. To the west lay the Khwarezmian Empire, wealthy and sophisticated, controlling critical arteries of the Silk Road. Its cities, rich in trade, scholarship, and fortified confidence, stood as symbols of stability in a volatile region. Its ruler believed distance and stone walls were enough. What followed was not born from immediate aggression, but from insult. A commercial mission turned into an accusation. Diplomacy turned into humiliation. And humiliation, in the political culture of the steppe, demanded response. What began as a preventable dispute would escalate into a campaign so relentless that entire cities would vanish, trade networks would fracture, and the balance of power from China to the Middle East would shift permanently. This is the story of how one decision, made in arrogance rather than foresight, unleashed a storm that consumed an empire. In 1218, Genghis Khan did not turn his armies westward in search of conquest. Instead, he sent merchants. It was a calculated move, grounded in pragmatism rather than aggression. The Mongol Empire had already secured vast territories across the steppe and northern China. Stability meant trade, and trade meant revenue, intelligence, and influence. A caravan of several hundred men, carrying textiles, precious metals, and diplomatic assurances, set out for the frontier city of Otrur, a commercial gateway of the Khwarezmian Empire. From the Mongol perspective, this was an opportunity to establish a profitable relationship with a powerful neighbor. From the viewpoint of Otrur's governor, it looked like something far more dangerous. Suspicion took hold. Rumors of espionage spread quickly in a political climate already thick with mistrust. Rather than verify intentions through measured diplomacy, the governor acted decisively and disastrously. The merchants were arrested. Their goods were confiscated. Most were executed. News of the massacre traveled back across the steppe. Yet the response from Genghis Khan was not immediate retaliation. Instead, he pursued what many leaders in his position might have abandoned: diplomacy. He dispatched envoys to Shah Muhammad II, demanding justice. The request was straightforward: punish the governor responsible, compensate the losses, and restore normal relations. The message was clear: this crisis could still be contained. What happened next transformed a regional dispute into a continental war. The Shah refused accountability. One Mongol envoy was killed outright. Others were publicly humiliated, their beards burned, a deliberate insult in steppe culture, where honor and authority were inseparable. In that act, diplomacy collapsed entirely. For the Shah, this may have seemed like a display of strength. For the Mongols, it was a declaration that negotiation had failed. Blood demanded answer. What began as a commercial mission became the catalyst for one of the most devastating campaigns in medieval history. And the tragedy was this: it did not have to happen. When diplomacy collapsed, Genghis Khan did not rush blindly toward revenge. He prepared. That distinction matters. History often remembers the destruction, but rarely pauses to examine the organization that made it possible. Before a single Mongol horse crossed into Khwarezmian territory in 1219, the groundwork had already been laid with remarkable precision. Intelligence came first. Mongol scouts fanned out across Central Asia, mapping desert routes, river crossings, and mountain passes. They gathered information on garrison sizes, political tensions, and supply depots. Communication networks relayed updates quickly across vast distances. In modern terms, this was strategic reconnaissance on a continental scale. Decisions were not based on impulse but on data. Logistics followed. The Mongol army was built for endurance. Each cavalryman maintained multiple horses, allowing units to travel 60 to 100 miles per day when necessary. Camels carried provisions across arid terrain. Supply lines were flexible rather than fixed, reducing vulnerability. Siege engineers, many drawn from conquered territories in northern China, accompanied the cavalry, bringing expertise in breaching fortified cities. This was not a raiding force. It was a mobile war machine designed for sustained operations. Across the border, the Khwarezmian Empire adopted a very different posture. Shah Muhammad II relied heavily on fortified cities, Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, believing their thick walls and geographic distance would slow any invasion. Instead of concentrating his forces into a unified field army, he dispersed them among regional garrisons. On paper, this created multiple defensive points. In practice, it fragmented command and diluted strength. The contrast in military thinking could not have been sharper. The Shah trusted static defenses and numerical manpower. Genghis Khan trusted coordination, speed, and unity of command. The Mongols did not advance as a single mass. They divided into several columns, each capable of independent maneuver yet synchronized toward common objectives. Mobility became their decisive weapon. By the time the campaign began, the outcome was not guaranteed, but the advantage was clear. One empire prepared for a siege. The other prepared for a storm. The campaign began where the insult had first been delivered, at the frontier city of Otrar. In 1219, Mongol forces surrounded the city with methodical precision. This was no impulsive raid driven by rage. It was a deliberate opening move, calculated to demonstrate that actions carry consequences. Otrar had been the site where merchants were executed and diplomacy dismissed. Now it would become the first example of what defiance meant. The siege unfolded over several months. Mongol engineers constructed siege engines, battering rams, and catapults, tools refined during earlier wars in northern China. Supply routes were cut. Communication lines were severed. The defenders held out behind thick walls, trusting in fortifications that had long symbolized security and permanence. Yet walls, no matter how strong, cannot compensate for isolation. The Mongols were patient. They understood that pressure, sustained and disciplined, erodes resistance. Eventually, betrayal from within accomplished what brute force alone could not. A faction inside the city opened the gates, hoping perhaps for mercy or personal survival. It was a reminder that unity under siege is fragile when leadership is compromised. Once Mongol forces entered, resistance collapsed quickly. The governor responsible for arresting and executing the Mongol merchants was captured. Chroniclers record that molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment designed to symbolize greed and treachery. Whether embellished or not, the story spread rapidly across the region. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not random violence. It was retribution framed as justice. The fall of Otrar sent a message far beyond its walls. To cities across the Khwarezmian Empire, it signaled that negotiation had ended and accountability had begun. Compliance might preserve life. Defiance would invite destruction. In strategic terms, Otrar was more than a battlefield victory, it was psychological positioning. It demonstrated that the Mongol response would be systematic, relentless, and unforgettable. The storm had arrived, and Otrar was only the beginning. After Otrar fell, many in the Khwarezmian Empire believed the worst had passed. They assumed the Mongols would advance along predictable roads, follow river valleys, or take the obvious military corridors. What they did not anticipate was audacity. Instead of marching where expected, Genghis Khan led a large force across the Kizilkum Desert, an expanse many considered impassable for an army. It was a calculated risk, but also a masterstroke. By the time Mongol riders appeared on the horizon near Bukhara in early 1220, they seemed less like an invading army and more like an apparition rising from the sand. The city was stunned. Bukhara was no frontier outpost. It was one of the great cultural and commercial centers of Central Asia, fortified and confident in its status. Yet speed had shattered its sense of security. The defenders scrambled. Local forces attempted resistance, but coordination collapsed under the weight of surprise. Panic spreads faster than fire, especially when expectations are overturned. The Mongols had not simply arrived. They had materialized where no one believed they could. When the city fell, the event carried more than military significance. According to Persian chroniclers, Genghis Khan entered the Grand Mosque and addressed the population. Whether every word is recorded precisely or shaped by history, the symbolism is undeniable. Standing at the heart of a proud Islamic city, he framed himself not merely as a conqueror, but as an instrument of judgment. He is said to have declared that he was the punishment sent by heaven for their corruption. In that moment, the psychological balance shifted. Resistance no longer felt like a defense of territory. It felt like defiance against destiny. What followed was harsh and deliberate. Portions of the city were destroyed, and many inhabitants were killed or enslaved. But beyond the physical devastation, the greater impact was emotional. Stories traveled along trade routes faster than caravans. Bukhara, a jewel of the region, had fallen with shocking speed. If Bukhara was vulnerable, what city was safe? This was terror used strategically, not impulsively. Fear became a force multiplier. Some cities would resist and suffer. Others, having heard what happened at Bukhara, would open their gates without a fight. In modern terms, it was psychological warfare executed with precision. The Mongols understood something timeless. When you control perception, you often control outcomes. If Bukhara was the psychological blow, Samarkand was the decisive fracture. The city stood as the military heart of the Khwarezmian Empire, its fortress walls thick, its garrison large, its confidence unshaken. Here, the Shah had concentrated tens of thousands of troops, including seasoned cavalry and war elephants meant to intimidate and overwhelm. On paper, Samarkand represented strength. In reality, it exposed fragility. Genghis Khan understood that empires rarely fall from a single strike. They collapse when their center gives way. Samarkand was that center. The Mongols approached with discipline, surrounding the city while maintaining mobility. They did not rush blindly at the walls. Instead, they probed, tested, and waited. Siege engines were brought forward, but just as powerful were the tactics of deception that had become a Mongol signature. Outside the walls, Mongol units executed feigned retreats, pulling back deliberately to lure defenders into pursuit. It was an old-step tactic, refined to near perfection. Khwarezmian cavalry, eager to prove themselves, charged out in fragmented waves. Once separated from the safety of the city, they found themselves encircled. What looked like retreat became entrapment. What felt like momentum turned into annihilation. Inside Samarkand, unity began to crumble. Many of the Shah's forces were not native loyalists but conscripts and auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. They did not share a single identity or a unified sense of purpose. As news spread of defeats outside the walls, confidence eroded. Some commanders questioned leadership. Others calculated survival. Defections followed. Entire units surrendered or negotiated in secret, hoping to spare themselves. The Mongols exploited these fractures ruthlessly. Psychological pressure combined with visible tactical superiority. The illusion of impregnable defense gave way to suspicion and doubt. When the city finally fell, it was not merely because its walls were breached. It fell because its cohesion dissolved. And then came the most telling moment. The Shah fled. Rather than rallying his forces or dying in defense of his capital, he abandoned Samarkand and retreated westward, pursued relentlessly. Leadership matters, whether in business, politics, or war. When the man at the top runs, the structure beneath him rarely stands long. With Samarkand subdued, the backbone of Khwarezmian military power was broken. What remained was not an empire defending itself, but scattered resistance awaiting its end. When Samarkand fell, the campaign did not slow. It accelerated. What followed was not a conventional victory lap, but a pursuit across thousands of miles, an operation so vast in scale that it redefined what medieval warfare could look like. Genghis Khan did not merely want submission. He wanted finality. The Shah fled westward, believing distance would buy survival. Across deserts, over mountain passes, and through unfamiliar terrain, Mongol detachments followed with relentless precision. They did not move as a lumbering army burdened by supply trains. They advanced in coordinated columns, living off mobility, intelligence, and discipline. Messages traveled quickly through relay riders. Commanders adapted in real time. The pursuit stretched from Central Asia toward the Caspian Sea, an expanse that, to an American audience, would feel like chasing a fugitive from Chicago to the Atlantic coastline without losing contact. This relentless pressure carried psychological weight. Every city that considered resistance understood the pattern. Resistance brought annihilation. Surrender sometimes brought survival. The Shah, increasingly isolated, watched his authority evaporate. Governors calculated their own futures. Alliances dissolved. An emperor without an army, without a capital, and without loyalty is an emperor in name only. Eventually, the Shah died in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea, far from the grandeur of his court, far from the empire he once ruled. His death was not marked by ceremony but by obscurity. It symbolized more than personal defeat. It marked the collapse of centralized Khwarezmian power. Meanwhile, Urgench, one of the empire's wealthiest cities, became the final brutal chapter. Unlike earlier sieges, this battle was fiercely contested. Urban fighting was intense, costly, and destructive. The Mongols, frustrated by resistance and the city's complex canals, responded with overwhelming force. When Urgench fell, it signaled that organized resistance had effectively ended. And yet, even in destruction, there was calculation. Skilled artisans, engineers, and administrators were often spared and relocated. Genghis Khan was not pursuing chaos for its own sake. He was dismantling political opposition while selectively preserving talent that could strengthen his expanding empire. By the campaign's end, the message was unmistakable. This was not a raid, not a border war, but the systematic erasure of a regime. An empire that had once controlled vast trade routes and immense wealth had been pursued, cornered, and extinguished across a continent. The destruction of Khwarezm was not an accident of momentum. It was the product of deliberate design. Behind the devastation stood a coherent strategy, one that blended speed, intelligence, unity of command, and psychological warfare into a system that overwhelmed a larger but fractured opponent. Mobility was the foundation. Mongol cavalry could travel 60 to 80 miles a day when necessary, crossing deserts and mountains with a pace that stunned defenders accustomed to slower medieval armies. Operational speed meant more than movement, it meant decision-making without delay. While Khwarezmian commanders debated and hesitated, Mongol generals executed. Campaign plans were flexible, decentralized in execution but unified in purpose. Intelligence superiority amplified that advantage. Genghis Khan invested heavily in reconnaissance and local informants. He understood terrain, trade routes, and political fault lines before committing major forces. In modern business terms, he did not enter a market blindly. He studied it, mapped its weaknesses, and struck where resistance was thin. Equally critical was unity of command. There were no rival courts competing for influence, no divided loyalties between governors. Orders flowed from a single center of authority. In contrast, the Khwarezmian Empire was plagued by distrust between the Shah and his generals. Leadership fragmentation became strategic paralysis. Psychological warfare sealed the outcome. The fall of one city became a warning to the next. Terror was not random, it was calibrated. News traveled faster than armies, and fear often opened gates before arrows were loosed. Resistance promised annihilation, submission sometimes meant survival. That clarity, however brutal, created predictable outcomes. The geopolitical consequences were profound. With Khwarezm shattered, Central Asia entered a new era. Trade routes once fractured by regional rivalries came under a single imperial umbrella. This would later evolve into what historians call the Pax Mongolica, a period when merchants could travel from China to the Mediterranean with unprecedented security. Commerce expanded. Ideas moved. The map of Eurasia shifted. Yet there is a deeper lesson here about leadership and arrogance. The initial conflict began not from inevitability, but from pride. An insult mishandled, envoys humiliated, diplomacy dismissed. Decisions at the top carry consequences that ripple outward. For entrepreneurs, executives, or policymakers watching today, the lesson is timeless. Misjudgment at the strategic level can unleash forces beyond control. And then there is the human dimension. Cities burned. Families were uprooted. Entire communities vanished. Empires rise and fall in textbooks, but they are lived by ordinary people. Behind every strategic success lies a human cost. That duality, brilliance, and brutality defines the legacy of this campaign. When we look back at Genghis Khan's Khwarezm campaign of 1219 to 1221, we are not simply witnessing the fall of a regional empire. We are standing at a turning point in world history. In the span of just a few years, the political map of Central Asia was erased and redrawn. Trade routes were restructured. Power balances shifted. The consequences rippled from the Silk Road to the edges of Europe. What began as a diplomatic dispute became a transformation of continents. At its core, this story is about the cost of miscalculation, a governor's suspicion, a shah's pride, a refusal to correct a mistake. For leaders, whether in government, business, or creative ventures, the lesson is sobering. Strategic arrogance can unleash forces that cannot be contained. Decisions made in moments of ego can define decades of consequence. Yet this campaign is also a study in power and judgment. Genghis Khan demonstrated unity of command, operational clarity, and relentless execution. He understood logistics, intelligence, and morale long before those words became modern management jargon. History, in that sense, is not distant. It is a strategic classroom. The patterns repeat. The stakes remain. For those of us living in a world still shaped by geopolitical rivalry and economic interdependence, the echoes are unmistakable. Empires may change names, but human nature does not. Power demands wisdom. Authority demands restraint. And judgment, above all, demands humility. If you found value in this deep dive into one of history's most consequential campaigns, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Join a community of thoughtful viewers who believe history is more than dates and battles. It is insight, strategy, and perspective. Together, we'll continue exploring the moments when a single decision reshaped the world.